I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to today's Outside Source. We'll begin with a significant development on the coronavirus. A cheap steroid that's been around since the 1960s has been proven to reduce the risk of dying from COVID-19. 20 Indian soldiers have been killed in a confrontation with Chinese forces in disputed Kashmir.
Chokeholds will be banned, except if an officer's life is at risk.
Also, after huge protests across the US, Donald Trump signs an executive order addressing police brutality. Critics are saying he hasn't gone far enough. And we're going to be live in the Galapagos Islands because Diego, the giant tortoise whose sex drive saved his species, has retired at the age of 100. We'll be speaking to a scientist who's met him. Well, welcome to the programme. Let's begin with this very important development on the coronavirus. For the first time, a drug has been shown to cut the risk of dying from COVID-19. Better still, it's a cheap and widely available steroid called dexamethasone. Research has been led by a team at the Oxford University, and that team says it's astounded by the results. Here's the BBC's medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
For those laid low by COVID-19, for the very sickest hospital patients, at last, a drug that can tip the odds in their favour. 6,000 NHS COVID patients were part of the trial, and the results were so overwhelmingly positive, they were rushed out days after the study was completed. It found that dexamethasone saves one life for every 8 patients on a ventilator, and one life saved for every 25 patients on oxygen. If it had been used from the outset of the pandemic, it's thought it could have saved 4,000 to 5,000 lives in the UK. Catherine Milbank from Buckinghamshire spent 12 days on a ventilator with COVID-19. She received dexamethasone after her husband Paul gave consent over the phone for her to take part in the trial.
When someone tells you that your wife's right hanging on the edge of something that could go either way, and you know that there's current proven drugs that are already in the medical industry already that are prescribed to people, when you know that they are around and there's a chance that might help, you grab it.
Without trying these things, we're not the researchers, us, no one's going to get anywhere in finding out the right drugs to help the pandemic that's happening and still going on as we're coming through it, but I'm just eternally grateful and will be for the rest of my life.
Dexamethasone has been around for decades. A steroid, it's widely used for arthritis, asthma and other conditions. This is a genuine breakthrough in the treatment of COVID-19. Dexamethasone, either in tablet or injectable form, is available in every hospital pharmacy. The treatment costs around £5 on the NHS and will be even cheaper in developing countries. So this drug has the potential to save lives across the world. The drug helps stop the immune system from overreacting to COVID. It's not a cure, but it will help more of the sickest patients to overcome this disease.
Well, Professor Martin Landray of Oxford University is one of the chief researchers on this study. Here he is explaining the significance.
As a scientist, as a clinician, as a doctor, always cautious, always careful. But when we first saw this result, it wasn't what we were expecting. It was just way more than that. To see such clear results in the sickest patients. So, as you heard on that piece, we've been searching for a treatment that will save lives, and it's right under our noses. It's a drug that's widely available, very affordable. This is completely practical treatment, and and practical around the world. I mean, it is a lovely result.
And there's more on that story on the BBC News website. Next, we switch to Washington. Donald Trump's been laying out his ideas for police reform in the Rose Garden of the White House. Bear in mind, yesterday, not for the first time, he was tweeting "law and order" in capital letters. Today, he was saying this.
Americans also believe we must improve accountability, increase transparency, and invest more resources in police training, recruiting, and community engagement.
And the president gave us some detail on how he's planning to do that.
Today, I'm signing an executive order encouraging police departments nationwide to adopt the highest professional standards to serve their communities. These standards will be as high and as strong as there is on earth.
Well, the President didn't take any questions, but of course there are plenty of questions to be asked about exactly what all of this means in practical terms and when it'll happen. We know these reforms include banning chokeholds unless an officer's life is at risk, offering federal grants to improve police practices. That will include a database to trace officers with complaints against them, and encouraging the deployment of social workers alongside of officers to deal with non-violent scenarios such as drug use or homelessness. Well, let's have a look at some of the reaction to this. Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, said this will not deliver the comprehensive, meaningful change and accountability in our nation's police departments that Americans are demanding. And we've also heard from Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a civil rights advocate who started the Say Her Name campaign that seeks to highlight black women who've been killed by US police, Breonna Taylor being the most high-profile recent example. And here is Kimberly Crenshaw's reaction to the president's executive order.
This is a president that himself led an attack on peaceful protesters just a couple weeks ago in order to stage a photo op. So the idea that suddenly he is now in front of this issue, I think really shows just how much power is coming from the streets upward. Now, let's not forget at the same time that the one thing that this president has said is not on the table, and is probably one of the most important things that can be done, is lifting the qualified immunity that so many police officers have that makes it so difficult to actually seek accountability through suing them.
Well, President Trump also met privately with families of those affected by racial and police violence. Here's what he said about doing that.
Many of these families lost their loved ones in deadly interactions with police. To all of the hurting families, I want you to know that all Americans mourn by your side. Your loved ones will not have died in vain.
Let's bring in Anthony Zerka, who's following this all from Washington, D.C. And Anthony, when we were talking maybe a week back, 10 days back, the president wasn't sounding like a man who would end up making these kind of announcements.
No, and I think it's a reflection of the breadth of popular support for some sort of police reform nationwide that he has decided to take these actions. You have to remember, however, that what he's putting forward in this executive order, they're guidelines, they're recommendations, they're things that he's encouraging police departments across the country to cooperate with, and if they do so, then they will be prioritized with existing federal grant money. So even say the chokehold ban, he's not outlawing chokeholds across the United States. He's saying police departments should do that, and if they do outlaw chokeholds, then they will be given access to a large pool of federal money that is available for law enforcement that Congress has already authorized.
And in terms of how to make fundamental shifts in the US, you allude to a problem perhaps you could expand on, which is that actually policing is very devolved in the US. Is that right?
It is. Every city, every county has its own police network, police system, and they have their own rules. Now, there are state guidelines that they operate under. There are federal guidelines that they operate under, but they have a significant amount of autonomy. So if you're looking at where you're going to see very real change, you have to look at these cities and these states. And you are seeing things. You've seen the state of New York impose new requirements, have a chokehold ban for all of their law enforcement officers. You see instances in Minneapolis and Los Angeles and Atlanta where there's really significant police reform taking place. But at least on a nationwide level, and you saw this in Donald Trump's speech, an acknowledgement of this in Donald Trump's speech, and that's that Congress will have to step in if you want something permanent and mandatory to happen. Congress has to pass the law. The president, with executive orders, can direct funds, can encourage, can set up systems and foundations for reform, but it doesn't have the same sort of weight that a law passed by Congress and signed by the president would have.
And Anthony, can I ask you about one detail? The president's saying that there'll be a new system by which if there's a complaint against an officer, that will be known across the US. On the face of it, that seems significant. I've heard lots of protesters complaining something like that doesn't exist. Is it as significant as it appears?
If the system is set up and police departments across the country cooperate with it, are involved in it, share the information in this database, and that database is disseminated widely so that people, researchers, and the American public have access to, police departments that may say have an increased number of violations, an increased number of abuse of power allegations, and disciplinary actions towards police officers, then yes, I think it would be very useful. But again, it is very dependent on the cooperation of individual police departments, barring some sort of federal law, because all the Trump administration right now can do is say, if you don't cooperate, we're not going to give you some of this money, we'll give it to some other police department. The Obama administration tried to set up structures that police departments should comply with, and again, the compliance was very spotty. So it all depends on how nationwide this is.
Anthony, appreciate you taking us through it. Thank you very much indeed. There's Anthony in Washington. Now, let's talk about the Indian Army, which is saying 20 of its soldiers have been killed by Chinese troops in the disputed Kashmir region. This is the first deadly clash on this border in 45 years. Initially, the Indian Army said 3 soldiers had died and others were wounded. But now we have this updated statement saying 17 troops who were critically injured at the standoff location and who were exposed to sub-zero temperatures in the high-altitude terrain have succumbed to their injuries, and so the death toll is now 20. China, for its part, is accusing India of crossing the border and attacking its personnel. Well, let's have a look at the border in question. This is the Galwan River Valley area. Both sides have been deploying thousands of troops on either side in recent weeks. Well, let's speak to Shashank Joshi, defence editor of The Economist, who's live with us. Thank you very much for your time. Before we get into the details of the last 24 hours or so, help us understand why tensions have been growing in the last few weeks.
Sure. Well, this is a strategic area for India. It's right up in the far north. For China, this is on the western edge of Tibet. As you pointed out, this is the first major attack since 1975, and that's partly because they've both learned how to manage their differences. The border is absolutely enormous. It's almost entirely undefined, so patrols effectively overlap. The reason tensions have been growing in the last few weeks isn't entirely clear, but it's probably to do with the fact that India has been upgrading the infrastructure on its own side of the border in this area, known as Ladakh. Over the past several years, particularly over the past year, they've completed a vital road that runs south to north. And what seems to have happened is the Chinese side has interpreted that as a challenge to the status quo and a threat to their own forces on the Chinese side, effectively to the east.
And with regard to the particular circumstances in which these 20 Indian soldiers died, do you have any detail at all?
We have some details from Indian accounts, although how reliable they are is open to question. What appears to have happened is a few days ago, the Indian and the Chinese sides agreed to effectively defuse the crisis. They agreed to disengage from several positions. The standoff is in 3 places. The Galwan River Valley is one of them. The other 2 are Pangong Lake to the south, and the other one is called Hot Springs, which is also to the south. The Chinese side appears to have agreed to disengage from at least 2 of those, including Galwan Valley. What seems to have occurred is an Indian patrol was waiting to meet the Chinese side to discuss details of that withdrawal, of the details of that disengagement, so that both sides would move several kilometers back. We don't know exactly what transpired, but that seems to have devolved into a fight. Now, troops on both sides don't use weapons because they have various protocols and agreements to not do so over the years. But the Chinese side appears to have used stones, clubs, sticks with nails in them, according to some Indian accounts, to attack the Indian side, many of whom subsequently were critically injured, and some of whom may have fallen in some way in that punishing terrain and succumbed to frostbite or exposure overnight. Many others may have succumbed to their injuries from that conflict itself. There have also been some Chinese casualties, but we don't know how many, and we don't know if there have been any fatalities.
And as we listen to these extraordinary accounts coming in, what's the strategic context here, aside from the national pride of these moments being played out on the international stage? Why are both countries so focused on this particular border?
Well, let's remember here that India and China are not just Asia's two biggest rising powers, or two of the world's most important rising powers. They fought a war over this patch of land back in 1962, a war in which China essentially rapidly defeated India. And that has been a historical trauma for India in subsequent decades. Now, they stabilized the border in many ways. As you said, there hasn't been a shot fired since 1975. This is the worst clash since 1967. But at the same time, they have been competing for influence all over Asia. India doesn't like the fact that China is allied very closely to Pakistan, that the Chinese Navy is increasingly busy in the Indian Ocean. And of course, China doesn't like the fact that India and India's successive Indian governments have moved ever closer to the United States, China's rival. And so the geopolitical context effectively compounds the local tensions at the border itself, making for a very volatile mix.
Shashank, that's been invaluable. Thank you very much indeed. That's Shashank Joshi, defence editor of The Economist. Now, in a few minutes on Outside Source, we're going to update you on a number of important stories in the UK. One of them is the government's announced overseas aid will no longer have a government department dedicated to it. It'll become part of the Foreign Office. We'll bring you the reaction of some affected charities. South Korean officials have described the North Korean destruction of a joint liaison office as a senseless and unprecedented act. Pyongyang admitted it blew up the building in the border city of Kaesong. Here's our correspondent in Seoul, Laura Bicker.
The Ministry of Unification here in Seoul has confirmed that at 2:49 local time, an explosion was heard and seen at the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in the border town of Kaesong. The National Security Council has been convened. Commanders, military commanders along the border have been sent to their posts. Now, this is in essence a bit of theatre. This was an empty building. It was also a threat that North Korea had made over the last few days. The latest came from Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong. On Saturday, she said that the building would be collapsed. Here we are a few days later, and it seems that is the case. State media in North Korea have also confirmed that the building has been destroyed.
I'm Ross Atkins with Outside Source. We're here at the BBC Newsroom as usual. Our lead story is that a cheap and widely available drug has been shown to cut the risk of dying from COVID-19 for severely ill patients. Now, the UK government's announced a major change in how it provides aid money around the world. For years, its aid has been distributed and coordinated by the Department for International Development, DFID as it's known. Well, that department will now merge with the UK's Foreign Office. Now, that might sound a little bit like government bureaucracy playing out, but actually this cuts to the fundamentals of who gets UK aid and what the UK seeks in return for that aid. Here's Prime Minister Boris Johnson making the announcement.
The Foreign Secretary will be empowered to decide which countries receive or cease to receive British aid while delivering a single UK strategy for each country, overseen by the National Security Council, which I chair. Those strategies will be implemented on the ground by the relevant ambassador, the relevant UK ambassador, who will lead all of the government's work in the host country.
Well, let's take a look at the role of the current Department for International Development. Its brief is to administer overseas aid with the aim of promoting sustainable development and combating world poverty. And at the moment, the UK spends 0.7% of its annual national income on aid. That's around £15 billion, around $19 billion. Only Germany and the US donate more. And the UK government says that commitment to a 0.7% contribution isn't changing. Next, here's Boris Johnson again, this time talking about the work that's been done by DFID, the outgoing department.
They have striven to protect millions of children across the world from polio, which is now on the verge of global eradication. They have paved the way for millions of girls to attend school for the first time in countries such as Pakistan, as I've seen for myself. They've done their utmost to ease the suffering in Syria, and in Sierra Leone, they were central to the defeat of an outbreak of the Ebola virus.
Well, this move's come in for some criticism. Former Prime Minister David Cameron's called it a mistake. He tweeted, "More could and should be done to coordinate aid and foreign policy, but the end of DFID will mean less expertise, less voice for development at the top table, and ultimately less respect for the UK overseas." The opposition Labour Party's leader, Keir Starmer, said the announcement was intended to deflect attention from Britain's coronavirus death toll, and the Scottish National Party has also criticised the decision.
The government are blatantly using challenging domestic circumstances as an excuse to wind down essential aid for the world's poorest. This is shameful and is not in our name, Mr. Speaker.
Now, for better or for worse, this decision is certainly going to have huge implications for the UK aid sector, which currently receives many millions of pounds via DFID. This is the chief executive of Oxfam.
It's been shown in other countries where the development department has been subsumed inside a foreign policy department, that the impact, that the value for money that taxpayers get in ending extreme poverty gets reduced. And that's our fear, especially at a time of COVID, where, you know, this pandemic is risking pushing 500 million more people into poverty.
Well, let's get some analysis on this decision taken by Boris Johnson. Here's the BBC's Helen Catt.
This merger's been on the cards for a while. Boris Johnson has wanted to do it for years, and earlier this year, in fact, there were signs when he did what's known as his cabinet reshuffle here, reappointing and appointing new ministers. Those that were in the Foreign Office were also in the Department for International Development, so the signs were there. And what Boris Johnson appears to be trying to do here is to try and align UK aid a bit more with its commercial and diplomatic interests. Now, you heard some of the criticism of that approach just now. There are those who support it, though. So Tom Tugendhat, who's a very senior MP here, is the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and someone who's known for saying when he thinks Boris Johnson has got it wrong on foreign affairs. He said he was pleased to see the Foreign Secretary would get more strategic oversight, although he will be asking some questions. Important to say that the total amount that the UK spends on aid, 0.7% of national income, is protected. But what you might see is it being spent in different places. So the Prime Minister, for example, has suggested that perhaps you might see less money going to Africa and more to, say, the Balkans, where Europe has vital security interests.
Thanks to Helen. Now, we're going to take a few moments to pause and look away from the most pressing stories of the day and reflect on a tortoise called Diego. Not just any tortoise, a giant one whose libido has saved his species from extinction, no less, and he's retiring. Here he is in the Galapagos Islands. He's 100, so this retirement's not unreasonable, and scientists estimate that he's fathered up to 900 giant tortoises, which are all alive today. You heard that right, 900. For decades, he's been kept in captivity on Santa Cruz Island as part of a breeding program. Before that, he was in a zoo in San Diego. Now, though, Diego's being returned to where he started off, on a tiny uninhabited island called Española, from which he was taken in the 1920s. Well, Emma Ridley works as a marine biologist in the Galapagos Islands. She's with us now from Santa Cruz. And Emma, I understand you know Diego. Tell us more about him.
Yes, I've been living and working in Galapagos for 25 years as a naturalist guide and taking groups of visitors to the installations where they have the captive breeding program. We got to see him pretty much every week for years. I think he's going to be much missed.
And what kind of life can he expect on this new island?
Well, he had he was pretty pampered where he was, lots of females, lots of food, and he did a great job. On his new island, I'm sure he'll have a lot more space. There's plenty of food there for the tortoises. The environment isn't that different to the one where he was in his pen. So I'm sure he'll manage to settle in very rapidly.
And in terms of his role in avoiding extinction for his species, am I overplaying it in saying that he was central to avoiding that?
He was a very important tortoise. The population was almost driven to extinction. There were 12 females, 2 males from the island, and then Diego came along. And he fathered probably about 40% on his own of all the young tortoise hatchlings that were brought back to Española.
Now, of course, I'm going to wish him a very long retirement. How long would we expect Diego to live for?
Well, they estimate that he's about 100 years old now. It's hard to know exactly how long giant tortoises can live, but scientists think it can be up to 150 years, maybe even a little more. So he should be around there for quite a bit longer.
Okay, that's good to hear. And just while I've got you, Emma, I'm curious to know more broadly how things are on the Galapagos Islands. It's a popular place for people to visit, and presumably that's been hit by the coronavirus.
Yeah, so Galapagos has been hit very, very hard. About over 70% of our income comes from tourism. So the fact that it just went from 100 to 0 in pretty much one day in mid-March has hit the population very, very hard.
And is there a prospect that you will not go back to normal, but it will lift from 0 at some point soon?
Well, the national park is actually opening back up to tourism in July. However, whether people will actually want to travel or be ready to travel is a whole different question. So hopefully, gradually, it will start to recover, but we don't think it's going to be anytime soon.
Great to talk to you, Emma. Thank you very much indeed. It's Emma Ridley, live with us from Santa Cruz in the Galapagos Islands. And, of course, best wishes to Diego. It sounds like he's got many decades of retirement to come, despite having been around for 100 years already. Thank you very much indeed to Emma for joining us. A reminder that on all the stories, I'm not sure if Diego's on the BBC News website, but just about all the stories we cover on Outside Source are available through the website bbc.com/news, and you can get it through the BBC News app as well. If you have a smartphone, you can download the app now. I'll see you in a few minutes. Bye-bye.